if you want to say something, you can.
No, I'll just say briefly, thank you very much. Really. It's a great honor and a pleasure to have been invited here and to speak to you this evening, and to have my friend Martin accompany me and work with me. What we have agreed to do is to read a passage, first in English and then in French, from a novel, Continental Drift, and then I will speak about a subject that I have been asked to speak about, and so it'll be my own version, or my own interpretation of the theme, which is indignation and commitment. And then I think you will summarize or speak about that, and then we would open it up to questions from the audience and discussion amongst us. Is that correct?
Perfect.
That's how we'll go. Okay. So I'm reading about 7 or 8 pages from the novel Continental Drift. Comes somewhat in the middle. It's not part of the story as such. It's a digression. You might want to know that the novel was written in the early 1980s, nearly, 30 years ago. And I don't think you need to know anything more about it than that. It's a chapter called Batterie Maconique, which is a stage in a Haitian Wudon ceremony. It's as if the creatures residing on this planet in these years, the human creatures, millions of them traveling singly and in families, in clans and tribes, traveling sometimes as entire nations, were a subsystem inside the larger system of currents and tides, of winds and weather, of drifting continents and shifting, uplifting, grinding, cracking land masses. It's as if the poor forked creatures who walk, sail, and ride on donkeys and camels, in trucks, buses, and trains from one spot on this earth to another were all responding to unseen natural forces as if it were gravity and not war, famine, or flood that made them move in trickles from hillside villages to gather along the broad, muddy riverbanks lower down and wait for passage on rafts down the river to the sea and over the sea on leaky boats to where they collect in eddies, regather their lost families and few possessions, set down homes, raise children, and become fruitful once again. We map and measure jet streams, weather patterns, prevailing winds, tides, and deep ocean currents. We track precisely scarps, fractures, trenches, and ridges where the plates atop the Earth's mass drive against one another. We name and chart the southeast and northeast trades and the Atlantic westerlies, the tropical monsoons and the doldrums, the Mistrals, the Santa Ana and the Canada High. We know the Humboldt, California, and Kuroshio currents, so that, having traced and enumerated them, we can look on our planet and can see that all the way to its very core, the sphere inhales and exhales, rises and falls, swirls and whirls in a lovely disciplined dance in time. It ages and dies and is born again constantly through motion, creating and recreating its very self like a Ouroboros, the snake that devours its tail. Seen from above, then, the flight of 1.5 million Somali men, women, and children with their sick and dying beasts out of the drought and war-shattered region of Ogaden in the Horn of Africa would resemble the movement of the southwest monsoon current, for instance, which in the heat of July moves slowly, almost imperceptibly out of the Red Sea just north of Ethiopia and Somalia, across the Gulf of Aden to the Indian Ocean, where it joins the northwest monsoon drift and dips southward along the subcontinent, by winter looping back again toward Kenya and Tanzania, bringing rain to Mombasa and Dar es Salaam and filling the great inland waterways and lakes. The movement of the Somalis would seem inevitable, unalterable, and mindless. And because we would have watched it the way we watched weather, it would seem tragic, We could not argue over who was at fault or what should have been done. Ideology would seem a form of vanity, a self-indulgence. We would rise from our shaded seat in front of our hut alongside the dusty road that leads from the treeless Damisa hills in Ethiopia to our village near the trading town of Samaso in Somalia, and we would step forward onto the road with a cup of water and a small bowl of millet and wave for the family we had been watching approach for the last hour, a man tall and gaunt, ageless, leading a half-blind camel with a pack of sticks tied to its back, and coming along behind a woman with a scrawny child in her arms, and behind her yet another cadaverous child. We let them sleep under their thin blankets beside our hut, and in the morning, as the sun breaks across the brown plain, give them bread and water and point the way southeast to Samaso, another 30 kilometers, and say the name of the man who is said to own a truck for transporting to the coast and the refugee camps there the people who come down from the hills, the Somali-speaking nomads who have raised cattle in that wilderness for 1,000 years, and who now must flee famine, drought, and the endless war between the Ethiopians with their Russian guns and Cuban allies, and the soldiers of the Western Somalia Liberation Front. The man, his black skin cut through almost to the bone of his face with worry and fatigue, nods and repeats the name of the man with the truck. He will take you to Kismayu, we say, just as we told the others, for nearly every day they come. The camps are there on the coast. There is food and shelter there, and people who will know how to cure your children of their sores. The man asks if there will be a price for this transportation. We shrug as if we don't know. He nods. He understands. Perhaps he will be able to sell his wretched camel. If not, he knows that one night soon, on the cold ground outside the tiny crossroads village of Samaso, they will die. First the children will die, then probably the man, and then the woman. And tomorrow, or the day after that, another family will come down from the hills and will cross the dry, hot plain along the rutted road. We'll stop for the night beside our hut, and in the morning we'll move on to the same fate. In these years, the early 1980s, most events and processes that have been occurring for millennia continue to occur, some of them silently, slowly, taking place an inch at a time, miles below the surface of the earth. Others noisily with smoke and fire, revolution, war, and invasion taking place on the surface. We measure the geological change in millimeters per annum, feel nothing move beneath our feet, and conclude, therefore, that nothing has happened. By the same token, when we read in newspapers and hear from the evening news broadcasts that there is revolution in Iran, war in Iraq, foreign soldiers and tanks in Afghanistan, because each new day brings a surfeit of such news, blotting out the news of the day before, news of Israelis in Lebanon replacing accounts of Russians in Afghanistan, Americans in Grenada replacing Israelis in Lebanon, we conclude here, too, that nothing has happened. The metabolic rate of history is too fast for us to observe it. It's as if attending to the day-long cycle of a single mayfly, we lose sight of the species and its fate. At the same time, the metabolic rate of geology is too slow for us to perceive it, so that from birth to death it seems to us who are caught in the beat of our own individual human hearts that everything happening on this planet is what happens to us, personally, privately, secretly. We can stand at night on a high, cold plain and look out toward the scrabbled, snow-covered mountains in the west, the same in the suburb of Denver as outside a village in Baluchistan in Pakistan. And even though beneath our feet continent-sized chunks of earth grind inexorably against one another, go on driving one or the other continent down so as to rise up and over it, as if desiring to replace it on the map, we poke with our tongue for a piece of meat caught between two back teeth and think of sarcastic remarks we should have made to our brother-in-law at dinner. While we stand and think of trivialities on the plain in Baluchistan, the crust of the earth in plates diverges, carves long, bottomless trenches beneath the sea between India and Antarctica, and shoves the last lost child of Gondwanaland north into Eurasia, attaches India and Pakistan to China, Afghanistan, and Iran with such irresistible force that the subcontinent bends and dips down at the line of convergence, buckles and crumbles at the edges, and heaps up, as if with the blade of a colossal shovel, the Himalayas and the Hindu Kush, 1,000 miles of mountain peaks 20 and 25,000 feet high, the very mountain peaks and passes we could see in the distance and have watched night after night all our brief distracted lives. And while we wait, with one son, the eldest, and a brother-in-law from Peshawar who has told us of the money to be made leading rich Afghans down from the passes to the refugee camps. We hope that he is right. We hope that the Afghans will indeed be wealthy and will be eager to pay us handsomely for escorting them down the mountain pathways where thieves hide in wait. But at the same time, we know the brother-in-law is wrong, for we have heard for years that the Afghans who flee to Pakistan are poor. It is the Iranians, we have heard, who are rich. The merchants who, crossing their border at Kahut, face the desert and then the mountains of the Makran Range and turn south, heading for Karachi and the sea, and eventually to America. Those who live down there, near the Iranian border, they are the ones who grow fat from escorting refugees, while we risk our lives up here with the Afghans for nothing. But the brother-in-law, an arrogant man who had played professional football in Lahore and therefore believes he knows what we do not, has insisted that we can make a year's money from a few days' work with little risk, and to convince him that he is wrong, or so we have said to him, we have agreed to come up here with the boy who is old enough to carry a rifle and walks behind us. Bandits, murderers, madmen, they live up here near the snow year-round and prey on travelers without guns. So we, the boy, even the brother-in-law, make a show of our weapons. As we climb closer and closer to the snow, we know that now they are watching us from behind rocks and from cliffs overhead. Then after a long while of climbing, we emerge from a narrow defile, and before us, beneath a long pale yellow ridge and in a large wedge of shadow, there is suddenly a mound of snow in the path, hard, old snow, the shape and size of a collapsed tent, and we see the bodies in the snow, a woman and 2 men and a child, throats slashed, old blood pinking the whiteness around them, clothes partially wrenched off and torn back from frozen bodies, bags and cases opened and scattered, papers, clothing, household utensils tossed aside in an angry hunt for coins. You see now, we say to the brother-in-law, they are poor. He pulls thoughtfully at his mustache, and the boy comes up alongside him and sees the Afghans lying in the snow, and frightened he turns in a slow circle, searching the rocks and crevices around us. There are plenty more Afghans coming, the brother-in-law says in a low voice. But perhaps another day would be better, he adds, and we turn and commence making our way back down the mountain to the village. The brother-in-law is a fool, and we are a fool for not believing what we know is true, what we know with our deepest brain, the one embedded in the very center of our skull, where we know that forever, from the beginning of time, the only outsiders who have come through here and have needed us to help them have been poor, sad, frightened creatures running from some army. Yes, there are more coming, we say, when soon the descent is not so difficult and we can walk alongside one another again. And they will keep on coming until after we are gone and the boy is gone, and even after that. And they will always be poor. You cannot help the poor, not when you also are poor. Let the bandits have them, we say. I suppose you are right, the brother-in-law murmurs, which pleases us, but we say nothing of it to him. Systems and sets, subsystems and subsets, patterns and aggregates of water, earth, fire, and air, naming and mapping them, learning the intricate interdependence of the forces that move and convert them into one another. This process gradually provides us with a vision of the planet as an organic cell, a mindless spherical creature whose only purpose is to be born as rapidly as it dies, and whose general principle informing that purpose, as if it were a moral imperative, is to keep moving. Revolve around points and rotate on axes, whirl and twirl and loop in circles, ellipses, spirals, and long curves that soar across the universe and disappear at last at the farthest horizon of our human imagination, only to reappear here behind us in the daily life of our body, in our food, shit, and piss, our newborn babies and falling down dead. Just keep on moving, keep breeding and pissing and shitting, keep on eating the planet we live on, keep on moving alone and in families and tribes, in nations and even in whole species. It's the only argument we have against entropy. And it's not truly an argument, it's a vision, it's a denial in the form of an assertion, a rebuttal in the form of an anecdote, which means that it's not a recounting, it's an accounting, not a representation, a presentation. The universe moves and everything in it moves, and by transferring its parts, it and everything in it down to the smallest cell are transformed and continue. Water, earth, fire, and air. To continue, just to go on, with entropy lurking out there, takes an old-fashioned biblical kind of heroism. That the sea move, that the waters flow from gulfs across whole oceans along continents and back again, is marvelous. That the continents themselves move, that they separate from one another, regroup and gather themselves into mountain ranges, plateaus, vast savannas, and grassy velds, is a wonder. That far beneath the deepest seas, the grinding of the plates that carry those continents generates sufficient heat to melt rock and erupt in fiery volcanoes, making high conical islands appear in the North Atlantic and South Pacific, where before dark water for millennia rolled uninterruptedly. This is truly worthy of admiration. And what is marvelous to us, what fills us with wonder and admiration, we must emulate or we die. If the stubborn determination of the Somali tribes to find food, water, and peace, even though they must cross deserts alone to get there and must often perish along the way, seems to us marvelous. And if the Afghans' willingness to face ice and snow and murderous bandits in the high passes of the Hindu Kush, rather than let government soldiers enter their villages and shoot them for having given shelter one night to a few ragtag local mujahideen guerrillas, if their decision to move away and start over elsewhere seems wonderful to us, and if the flight of 500,000 starving Khmer peasants out of Kampuchea into Thailand, where they are greeted by sympathetic but terrified Thai officials who drive the Khmer back to where the Vietnamese army wages war against the scattered remnant of Pol Pot's suicidal regime by burning the few remaining rice fields, if that persistent, relentless determination to go on knocking at the Thai gate until someone finally opens it moves us to admiration, then we must do the same. We must cross deserts alone and often perish along the way. We must move to where we can start our lives over, and when we get there, we must keep on knocking at the gate, shouting and pounding with our fists until those who happen to be keepers of the gate are also moved to admiration and open the gate. We are the planet, fully as much as its water, earth, fire, and air are the planet. And if the planet survives, it will only be through heroism, not occasional heroism, a remarkable instance of it here and there, but constant heroism, systematic heroism, heroism as governing principle.
Bonsoir. Quand il a été décidé de lire ces pages de Continent à la dérive, Continental Drift, qui est donc le 5e roman de Russell Banks et le premier traduit en français par Marc Chentier, avec une postface de Pierre Furlan qui sera ensuite son traducteur principal. Quand on avait imaginé lire ce texte, donc qui traite, vous allez l'entendre en français, de la dérive des continents et du modèle que ce schéma tellurique peut représenter pour le déplacement des populations de par le monde, on en parlait tout à l'heure avec Russell, on était évidemment loin d'imaginer que le soir où on lirait ça, à 100 km, enfin 1000 km d'ici, à Lampedusa et dans le sud de l'Italie, les scènes qui constituent la trame dramatique du roman seraient avérées par la réalité, puisque vous savez qu'hier soir, enfin hier dans la journée, il y a on hésite entre 150 et 300 morts, réfugiés des côtes africaines qui ont brûlé dans un bateau qui a sauté. Voilà. Et donc, ça dit évidemment quelque chose du monde, cette horreur-là. Ça dit quelque chose de l'indignation et de l'insuffisance de l'indignation. Et ça dit aussi quelque chose de l'art des romanciers, c'est-à-dire, comme dit Baudelaire dans un texte que je lirai tout à l'heure, hein, de leur talent à percevoir l'injustice là où d'autres yeux voient de la normalité. Et Continent à la dérive parle de destin de deux personnages qui sont chacun personnages qui sont comme tous les personnages de Russell Banks à la dérive de leur propre existence et qui essaient de faire de leur dérive, peut-être comme chacun d'entre nous, un mode de vie. Et le modèle, et là on voit un grand prosateur américain, le modèle que Russell Banks choisit pour expliquer la dérive des existences, c'est pas la psychologie, c'est la tectonique des plaques. Voilà. Et donc le titre du roman, Continental Drift, dérive des continents ou continent à la dérive, c'est donc le schéma des continents à la dérive pour expliquer les existences à la dérive. Et donc je vais lire le texte en français comme il avait été convenu. Et après quoi on entendra Russell parler de l'indignation et du commitment, de l'engagement. Donc on est au début en fait, hein, c'est le premier tiers du roman, batterie maçonnique. Tout se passe comme si les créatures qui résident sur cette planète en ces années-ci, les créatures humaines qui, par millions, voyagent seules ou en famille, en clans et en tribus, voyagent parfois par nations entières, constituent un sous-système à l'intérieur du système plus large des courants et des marées, des vents et des climats, des continents à la dérive et des masses de terre qui se meuvent et se soulèvent, s'abrasent et se disloquent. Tout se passe comme si les pauvres créatures fourchues qui marchent, voguent et chevauchent à dos d'âne, voyagent par camion, autocar et train entiers d'un point de cette terre à un autre, ne faisaient que répondre à l'appel de forces naturelles invisibles, comme si c'était la gravité et non la guerre, la famine ou les inondations, qui les faisaient sortir par petits groupes des villages, à flanc de collines, pour se rassembler sur les larges rives fangeuses de rivières en contrebas et attendre de pouvoir embarquer sur des radeaux pour descendre le courant vers la mer, traverser cette mer sur des bateaux qui prennent l'eau, jusqu'à parvenir au lieu où elles viennent s'amasser en remous, rassemblent leurs familles égarées et leurs maigres possessions, établissent leur logis, élèvent des enfants et deviennent à nouveau fertiles. Nous établissons la carte et mesurons l'ampleur des jet streams, des régimes climatiques, des vents dominants, des marées et des courants dans les profondeurs océanes. Nous repérons avec précision les escarpements, les fractures, les tranchées et les chaînes le long desquelles s'affrontent les plaques qui flottent à la surface de la masse terrestre. Nous nommons et nous répertorions les alizés de sud-est et de nord-est, les vents d'ouest de l'Atlantique, les moussons tropicales et les calmes équatoriaux, les Mistral, le Santa Ana et le Grand Canadien. Nous connaissons les courants de Humboldt, de Californie, et de Kuroshio. Ainsi, les ayant énumérés, ayant suivi leur parcours, nous pouvons contempler notre planète et constater que jusqu'en son noyau le plus profond, cette sphère inspire et expire, s'élève et s'écroule, tourbillonne et tournoie en une danse merveilleuse et disciplinée au cœur du temps. Elle vieillit, elle meurt et elle renaît sans cesse par le mouvement. Elle se crée et se recrée elle-même, tel un ouroboros, le serpent qui se dévore la queue. Vu de haut, donc, la fuite d'1,5 million de Somalis, hommes, femmes et enfants, quittant avec leurs bestiaux malades et mourant la région d'Ogaden, dans la Corne de l'Afrique, détruite par la sécheresse et la guerre, ressemblerait au mouvement du courant de mousson du sud-ouest, par exemple, qui, dans la chaleur de juillet, surgit lentement, presque imperceptiblement de la mer Rouge, juste au nord de l'Éthiopie et de la Somalie, traverse le golfe d'Aden en direction de l'océan Indien, où il rejoint le flux de mousson du nord-ouest et amorce sa descente vers le sud, le long du sous-continent, et se replie, l'hiver venu, vers le Kenya et la Tanzanie, apportant la pluie à Mombasa et Dar es Salaam, remplissant les immenses cours d'eau et les grands lacs de l'intérieur. Le déplacement des Somalis pourrait paraître inévitable, immuable et dénué de raison. Et dans la mesure où nous l'aurions observé à la manière dont nous observons le temps, ce déplacement pourrait sembler tragique. Nous ne pourrions échanger d'arguments quant aux responsabilités engagées, aux actions qu'il eût fallu entreprendre. L'idéologie ne serait alors qu'une forme de vanité, une coupable complaisance. Nous quitterions notre siège ombragé devant notre cabane au bord de la route poussiéreuse qui relie les collines sans arbres de Damissa en Éthiopie à notre village, proche du marché de Samasso en Somalie, et nous nous avancerions sur la route avec un car rempli d'eau, un bol de mil et de petits laits, destiné à la famille dont nous guettons depuis 1 heure l'approche. Un homme grand et décharné, sans âge, menant un chameau à moitié aveugle, sur le dos duquel est attaché un fagot, suivi d'une femme qui porte un enfant efflanqué dans ses bras, et plus loin derrière, d'un autre enfant cadavérique. Nous les laissons dormir sous leurs couvertures élimées, à côté de notre cabane, et le matin venu, alors que le soleil se lève de l'autre côté de la plaine brune, nous leur donnons du pain et de l'eau, en leur montrant le chemin qui mène vers Samasso, à 30 km au sud-est, et nous prononçons le nom de l'homme dont on dit qu'il possède un camion qui emmène vers la côte, et les camps de réfugiés qui s'y trouvent, ceux qui descendent des collines, les nomades de langue somalie qui, depuis 1000 ans, élèvent du bétail dans ce désert et sont maintenant contraints de fuir la famine, la sécheresse et la guerre interminable opposant les Éthiopiens, avec leurs canons russes et leurs alliés cubains, aux soldats du Front de libération de la Somalie occidentale. L'homme, dont les soucis et l'épuisement ont entamé presque jusqu'à l'os la peau noire du visage, hoche la tête et répète le nom de l'homme au camion. Pardon. Il vous emmènera à Kismayo, lui disons-nous, exactement comme nous l'avons dit aux autres, car presque chaque jour, il ne cesse d'arriver. Les camps se trouvent là-bas, sur la côte. Là-bas, nourriture et abri, des gens qui sauront guérir vos enfants de leurs plaies. L'homme demande alors s'il faudra payer ce transport. Nous haussons les épaules, comme si nous l'ignorions. Il hoche la tête, il comprend. Peut-être parviendra-t-il à vendre son misérable chameau. Sinon, il sait qu'un de ces soirs, bientôt maintenant, sur le sol froid, à l'orée du minuscule village de Samasso, à la croisée des chemins, ils mourront. D'abord, mourront les enfants, puis l'homme, puis la femme enfin. Et demain, ou le jour suivant, une autre famille descendra des collines et, suivant les ornières de la route, traversera la plaine sèche et brûlante, s'arrêtera pour passer la nuit à côté de notre cabane, et le jour venu, s'en ira vers un identique destin. En ce temps-ci, au début des années 80, la plupart des événements et des cycles qui se déroulent depuis des millénaires continuent de se dérouler, certains en silence, lentement, centimètre après centimètre, à des kilomètres au-dessous de la surface de la Terre, d'autres avec fracas, dans le feu et la fumée, révolutions, guerres et invasions se déroulant à la surface. Nous mesurons le changement géologique en millimètres par an, ne sentons rien bouger sous nos pieds, et nous en concluons donc que rien ne s'est passé. Et de la même façon, lorsque nous lisons dans la presse ou nous apprenons par le journal télévisé du soir qu'il y a eu une révolution en Iran, la guerre en Irak, des soldats et des tanks étrangers en Afghanistan, chaque jour apportant de telles informations en surabondance et effaçant celles de la veille, les nouvelles des Israéliens au Liban remplaçant les reportages sur les Russes en Afghanistan, les Américains à la grenade remplaçant à leur tour les Israéliens au Liban, nous en concluons là aussi que rien ne s'est passé. Le métabolisme de l'histoire évolue trop rapidement pour qu'il nous soit possible de l'observer. Tout se passe comme si, préoccupés de l'unique journée constituant le cycle vital d'un seul éphémère, nous perdions de vue l'espèce et son destin. Et en même temps, le métabolisme de la géologie évolue trop lentement pour qu'il nous soit possible de le percevoir, de sorte que, de la naissance à la mort, il nous semble, prisonniers que nous sommes du battement de nos cœurs humains pris un à un, que tout ce qui se passe sur cette planète, c'est ce qui nous arrive à nous, individuellement, personnellement, secrètement. Nous sommes parfaitement capables, le soir, debout sur une haute plaine froide, de contempler les montagnes égratignées et couvertes de neige qui s'élèvent à l'ouest, et peu importe que l'on se trouve alors dans un faubourg de Denver ou aux portes d'un village du Baloutchistan pakistanais, et bien que sous nos pieds des fragments de terre vastes comme des continents viennent inexorablement frotter les uns contre les autres, ne cessent de s'enfoncer tel ou tel continent de manière à s'élever pour passer au-dessus, comme s'ils désiraient prendre leur place sur la carte, de nous évertuer, tout ce temps, à extraire de la pointe de notre langue le petit morceau de viande qui s'est logé entre deux molaires et de songer aux remarques sarcastiques que nous aurions dû faire à notre beau-frère au cours du dîner. Pendant que nous sommes là, à penser à des choses parfaitement triviales sur cette plaine du Baloutchistan, la croûte terrestre, en plaques, se divise, creuse de longues fosses sans fond sous l'océan entre l'Inde et l'Antarctique, repousse l'ultime enfant perdu du Gondwanaland vers le nord pour lui faire intégrer l'Eurasie, relie l'Inde et le Pakistan à la Chine, l'Afghanistan et l'Iran, avec une puissance si irrésistible que le sous-continent ploie et s'incurve le long de la ligne de convergence, s'affaisse et s'écroule sur ses bords, soulève comme avec le fer d'une pelle colossale l'Himalaya et l'Hindoukouche, 1600 km de pics montagneux, s'élevant à 6 et à 8000 mètres, ces mêmes pics, ces mêmes cols que nous voyons au loin et que nous avons soir après soir passé le plus clair de nos brèves et folles existences à contempler. Et pendant que nous attendons, en compagnie d'un fils, l'aîné, et d'un beau-frère de Peshawar qui nous a parlé de l'argent qu'il y a à gagner en guidant de riches Afghans d'école au camp de réfugiés, nous espérons qu'il a raison. Nous espérons que les Afghans seront effectivement riches et qu'ils ne demanderont qu'à nous payer grassement pour leur service d'escorte le long des chemins qui descendent de la montagne et où des voleurs embusqués nous attendent. Mais en même temps, nous savons que le beau-frère a tort, car cela fait des années que nous entendons dire que les Afghans qui fuient vers le Pakistan sont pauvres. Ce sont les Iraniens, nous a-t-on dit, qui sont riches. Les marchands qui, traversant leur frontière à Kouak, se retrouvent face au désert, puis aux montagnes de la chaîne de Makran, et tournent vers le sud, en route pour Karachi, la mer, et au bout du voyage, l'Amérique. Ceux qui vivent là-bas, près de la frontière iranienne, voilà ceux qui se font du lard à escorter les réfugiés pendant que nous, ici, nous risquons pour rien nos vies avec les Afghans. Mais le beau-frère, homme plein d'arrogance qui a été professionnel de football à Lahore et croit par conséquent qu'il en sait plus que nous surtout, est formel. On peut gagner 1 an de salaire en quelques jours sans prendre grand risque, Et afin de lui prouver qu'il a tort, c'est du moins ce que nous lui avons dit, nous sommes convenus de monter ici avec le gamin, qui est assez âgé pour porter une carabine, et qui va marcher derrière nous. Des bandits, des assassins, des fous, tels sont les hôtes permanents de cette région, en bordure des neiges qui fondent sur les voyageurs désarmés. Aussi nous assurons-nous, et le jeune garçon aussi, et même le beau-frère, que nos armes sont bien en évidence. Alors que, gravissant la montagne, nous sommes de plus en plus près de la neige, nous savons qu'ils sont à nous observer de derrière les rochers, du haut des falaises qui nous dominent. Et puis, alors qu'après avoir longuement grimpé, nous sortons d'un défilé étroit, devant nous, en contrebas, le long d'une longue crête jaune pâle, à l'intérieur d'un vaste secteur d'ombre, se dresse soudain sur le chemin un amoncellement de neige, de vieille neige durcie, de la forme et de la taille d'une tente qui s'est écroulée, et là, nous voyons les corps allongés dans la neige. Une femme, 2 hommes et un enfant, la gorge tranchée, un sang ancien, rosissant la blancheur qui les entoure, leurs vêtements partiellement déchirés, arrachés à leur corps gelé, un peu partout des valises et des sacs ouverts, les papiers, les vêtements, les instruments de cuisine qu'ils contenaient, dispersés en tous sens, dans la rage de découvrir quelque argent. Alors tu vois, disons-nous au bon frère, ce sont bien des pauvres. Il tire sur sa moustache d'un air pensif. Le garçon arrive à sa hauteur et voit les Afghans étalés dans la neige. Épouvanté, il décrit lentement un grand cercle, explorant les rochers et les crevasses qui nous entourent. Des Afghans, il y en a plein d'autres qui arriveront, dit le beau-frère à voix basse. Mais peut-être qu'il vaudrait mieux un autre jour, ajoute-t-il, et faisant demi-tour, nous entamons notre descente en direction du village. Le beau-frère est un imbécile. Et nous sommes tous aussi imbéciles de ne pas croire ce que nous savons être vrai, ce que nous dit le recoin le plus obscur de notre cerveau, celui qui se cache au plus profond de notre crâne, où nous savons que de toute éternité, depuis le commencement des temps, les seuls étrangers à avoir traversé ces régions et avoir eu besoin de notre aide ont été de pauvres créatures tristes et craintives qui fuyaient une armée ou une autre. Oui, il y en aura d'autres qui arrivent, répondons-nous, dès que la descente est devenue un peu moins difficile et que nous pouvons de nouveau marcher de front, et ils continueront d'arriver jusqu'après notre mort, et après celle du Fils, et même encore après. Mais toujours ils seront pauvres. On ne peut pas aider les pauvres, pas quand on l'est soi-même. Que les bandits s'en chargent, disons-nous. Je suppose que tu as raison, dit le beau-frère dans un murmure, cela nous fait plaisir, mais nous ne lui avouions pas. Systèmes et ensembles, sous-systèmes et sous-ensembles, arrangements et agrégado de terre, d'air et de feu, les nommer, les renommer, apprendre l'interdépendance complexe des forces qui les meuvent et les convertissent les uns en les autres, semblable processus, nous fournit une vision de la planète comme cellule organique, création sphérique et sans raison, dont l'unique dessein est de naître aussi rapidement qu'elle se meurt, et dont le principe général, informant ce dessein comme s'il s'agissait d'un impératif moral, est de se maintenir en mouvement. Révolution autour d'un certain nombre de points, giration sur des axes, tourbillons et tournoiements, boucles et cercles, ellipses, spirales, courbes longues qui s'élèvent de par l'univers et disparaissent enfin à l'horizon le plus lointain de notre imagination humaine pour apparaître ici, derrière nous, dans la vie quotidienne de notre corps, dans notre nourriture, dans notre merde et notre pisse, le nouveau-né, ce qui s'effondre dans la mort, se mouvoir toujours, continuer de se reproduire, de pisser et de chier, continuer de manger la planète sur laquelle nous vivons, continuer de s'agiter, seul, par famille, par tribu, par nation, et même par espèce entière. Voilà donc notre seul argument contre l'entropie. Et il ne s'agit pas seulement d'un argument, mais d'une vision. C'est un déni en forme d'assertion, une réfutation en forme d'anecdote, ce qui signifie qu'il s'agit de contes, et non pas de comptabilité, non de représentation, mais de présentation. L'univers se meut, et tout se meut en lui, et par simple défalacement de ses diverses parties, cet univers et tout ce qu'il contient, jusqu'à la plus petite cellule, se voit transformé et continue d'être. L'eau, la terre, l'air et le feu. Continuer, simplement poursuivre son existence avec l'entropie qui est là à guetter, prend du même coup l'allure d'un acte d'héroïsme ancien et comme biblique. Que se meuvent les mers, que les eaux s'écoulent au long des golfes, traversent les océans, descendent des continents pour revenir encore, c'est la chose merveilleuse. Que se meuvent les continents eux-mêmes, qu'ils se détachent les uns des autres, qu'ils se regroupent et se rassemblent en chaînes de montagnes, en plateaux, en vastes savanes et en veldes herbeux, c'est la source du plus grand étonnement. Que loin, au-dessous des océans, les plus profonds, le frottement des plaques qui portent ces continents génère suffisamment de chaleur pour faire fondre la roche et provoquer le feu éruptif des volcans, faisant ainsi apparaître de hautes îles coniques dans l'Atlantique Nord ou le Pacifique Sud, là où, auparavant, n'avaient déferlé des millénaires durant et sans interruption que des flots sombres, cela mérite en vérité l'admiration. Et ce qui nous émerveille nous emplit d'étonnement et d'admiration, et il nous faut l'émuler ou mourir. Si la détermination obstinée des tribus somalis dans leur quête de nourriture, d'eau et de paix, même si leur découverte exige de traverser tout seul des déserts et implique fréquemment que l'on périsse en chemin, voilà qui nous paraît merveilleux. Et si la résolution des Afghans à s'exposer à la glace et à la neige, aux bandits meurtriers des cols vertigineux de l'Hindoukouche, plutôt que de laisser les soldats du gouvernement pénétrer dans leur village et les fusiller pour avoir abrité une nuit quelques guérilleros de la région, moudjahidines dépenaillés, si leur décision de s'en aller et de recommencer ailleurs leur vie nous paraît étonnante, et si la fuite d'un demi-million de paysans khmers mourant de faim, qui passent du Kampuchea en Thaïlande, ou les accueils des officiels thaïs pleins de sympathie et de terreur qui reconduisent les Khmers dans des lieux où l'armée vietnamienne fait la guerre aux résidus dispersés du régime suicidaire de Pol Pot en mettant le feu aux rares rizières qui restent, si cette détermination obstinée et inflexible de continuer à venir frapper aux portes des Thaïs jusqu'à ce que quelqu'un finisse par venir l'ouvrir force notre admiration, alors il nous faut faire de même. Il nous faut traverser seuls des déserts et souvent périr en chemin. Il nous faut aller là où il nous est possible de recommencer notre vie, et lorsque nous y parvenons, il nous faut continuer à frapper sans relâche à la porte, en criant et en cognant des poings, jusqu'à ce que ceux qui se trouvent être gardiens de cette porte-là soient aussi emportés par l'admiration et nous l'ouvrent. Nous sommes la planète, exactement au même titre que son eau, sa terre, son air et son feu, et si cette planète doit survivre, ce ne sera que par l'héroïsme. Pas par l'héroïsme occasionnel, illustré ici et là par d'admirables actes, mais par un héroïsme constant, systématique, un héroïsme érigé en principe directeur.
Oui. Thank you, Martin. That sounds very nice in French. I wish I had written it in French. The theme that I've been asked to address and have written this short essay concerning tonight is indignation and commitment. When I approached that theme, that assignment as it was, I realized that I began to think I have as an American, English-speaking American, I have a different sense of the word than it means in French. And so I went to the Oxford English Dictionary to see the definition of indignation in English. And I will read it to you, so you will see my problem. Meaning one, first meaning from the Oxford English Dictionary, indignation. The action of counting or treating a person or thing as unworthy of regard or notice. Disdain, contempt, contemptuous behavior or treatment. First usage is Chaucer, 1374. Second usage is Wycliffe, 1380, and so on. Also, treating with indignity. Quote from Sandys Travels, "The face of the Colossus is something disfigured by time or indignation of the Moors, detesting images." Meaning two, anger at what is regarded as unworthy or wrongful. Wrath excited by a sense of wrong to oneself or especially to others, or by meanness, injustice, wickedness, or misconduct. Righteous or dignified anger, the wrath of a superior. Here's the one I really love, meaning three. The turning of the stomach against unwelcome food. Don't you love the English language? So you see my difficulty in approaching the theme of indignation and commitment. And also, further, since I can only address the topic from the point of view, really, of a novelist, of a literary artist, it, in fact, brings me immediately to the question of the relationship between literature and politics, to the question of whether literature can change anything. As we know, novelists, story writers, and poets have nearly always positioned themselves in support of justice, human rights, and equality. As individuals, that is, as citizens of a particular nation, or even of the world, and why not? Who would position himself against justice, human rights, and equality? It's an easy vote to cast, no matter what your political party or ideology or religion happens to be. And on those occasions when literary men and women have taken up their pens and keyboards as journalists and political essayists, whether their personal politics are of the right, center, or left, they have inevitably written in defense of humanity against the forces of, well, inhumanity. In general, this is also true of philosophers and scientists, of musicians, of academics, of social scientists, and so on, the so-called intelligentsia, when they speak out as individuals. And this is not surprising, nor should it be. But a work of literature is not a vote. And a novelist writing, and I speak here mainly of novelists because I am one, is not a voter, or even for that matter, a citizen of a particular nation or of the world. My only flag, my skin, as the Italian writer Malaparte wrote. The novelist is neither a citizen, nor an essayist, nor a journalist, not when he or she is a novelist writing novels. And he's certainly not a politician, nor is he a political activist working for change. That is, writing fiction in support of a policy or a set of policy or of candidates for office. A novelist begins with mystery and ends with a further mystery. As the great American short story writer Flannery O'Connor said, mystery isn't something that is gradually evaporating. It grows along with knowledge. A novelist writing is simply a person sitting alone in a room with his or her sentences, composing them by the thousands, one at a time, learning from each new sentence that he or she writes what the next sentence will be. The fact is, the novelist speaks for no one but him or herself and writes solely to penetrate what would otherwise remain mysterious to him, morally or metaphysically or socially. Mysterious and impenetrable, except by means of the silent, solitary act of writing a novel, this novel, the one at hand. And the very same conditions will prevail when, after finishing this novel, he or she sits down at the desk and begins to write another. And perhaps this is why, in the history of the novel, so very few have managed to be a significant force for social change. You can count them on one hand. Many have tried, nearly all have failed. not necessarily as novels, but as significant forces for social change. I can't really speak for the European novel, but perhaps the most famous of American novels that actually had an effect on government policy are Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, published in 1906, which exposed the horrors of the meatpacking industry, leading to the passage of the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, and the creation of the Food and Drug Administration. And then there's Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, published in 1852, a runaway bestseller that electrified the anti-slavery movement and brought into the abolitionist fold thousands of decent white Americans who, until they read her novel, had not known where they stood on the greatest moral question we Americans have had to face. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a mawkish melodrama, because we all know now where we stand on the question of slavery. It's not much read today in the U.S., except in high schools and colleges, and usually as a part of the curriculum concerned with the causes of the Civil War. It's not read as literature, as a work of art. And it probably never was, not even when it was first published. It was read as argument, a powerful argument, against the enslavement of 3 million African Americans, in a broad, sentimental, two-dimensional way by means of a simple, highly contrived story, fussy Victorian prose, and a cast of stereotyped white and black characters. The novel, in spite of its aesthetic and artistic limitations, somehow at least partially humanized for white Americans a people that had been utterly dehumanized, thus making the argument against slavery convincing for those hundreds of thousands of readers of popular fiction who up to that point had not thought much about the subject, or whose opinions on the subject had depended upon the received opinions of their political leaders and clergy and other public spokesmen and women. Sinclair's The Jungle, in many ways, is as difficult to read today as Uncle Tom's Cabin. The workers are angelic, the bosses satanic. Everyone either wears a white hat or a black hat, and as soon as the workers discover socialism and organize themselves into labor unions, they all receive personality transplants and throw off their chains and triumphantly march from a socialist rally shouting, "Chicago will be ours." The prose is stilted and reads as if it's been badly translated from a novel by Maxim Gorky. But in spite of the importance of Uncle Tom's Cabin in the history of race in America, and the importance of The Jungle in bringing about reforms in the early industrialization of American food production, in spite of their incredible sales figures and inclusion in the so-called canon of American literature, they are not novels I myself would like to have written. There have been many like them, and there will be many more, I'm sure. Novels that in the interests of justice, human rights, and equality aspire to inspire significant political or social change and alter government policy. They call for change at the center. We call them protest novels. And they are written with as close an eye on the expectations, sentiments, and moral and political conventions of the audience as the most calculating bestseller, for more honorable reasons, of course, than simply to enrich the author. The fact is, a true novelist, that is to say, one who aspires to create a work of narrative art, has no thought of his or her audience, at least not when he or she is a novelist writing. Later, perhaps when one has gone from being a novelist writing to being an author, that is, a person who has finished a novel and actually published it, one thinks of his audience. Usually with low-grade anxiety, however, because it's too late by then to change anything. The truth is, one doesn't think of one's audience when one is actually engaged in the writing of the novel, when submitting oneself to the discipline and rigor and tradition of the history of the form, which require that one be at all times wholly honest and non-judgmental and as intelligent as possible, that one be, as Henry James proscribed, a person on whom nothing is lost. Yet if the only kind of novel that seems capable of fostering change in the larger world is the protest novel, an argument disguised as a story, propaganda for good or ill, it matters not, wrapped in narrative, why have so few serious literary artists deigned to write them? they can't be that difficult to write, especially since the best of them, the most effective that is, appear to be relying so heavily on ready-made structural templates, stereotyped characters, cliched language, sentimentality, easy judgments, and slapdash prose. To be honest, unless one is making a parody, it's as difficult to write badly on purpose as it is to write well. Also, perhaps the reason so few serious literary artists try to write protest novels is that they feel it's simply not their job to foster change in the larger world, at least not by means of their literary works. They have a different job. An author's task is to describe his or her people truthfully to themselves and to others. Without our authors, we as a people have no defined and accurate identity that simultaneously distinguishes us from others and ties us to them, to all of them, to the living and the long dead and to the yet unborn everywhere. The true task of the novelist is to dramatize first for him or herself and ultimately for the rest of us what it is to be human in our time and for all time. What it is to be human in our place and in every place. As a species, we have always depended upon our storytellers to tell us what it means to be human, to be ourselves. The history of story, from the caves of Lascaux, which I take to be visual aids to story, to the Odyssey and the Iliad, to the stories and novels, plays, poems, and films of today, shows us this. I believe that the history of one kind of story especially, the novel, from Cervantes to Salman Rushdie, Toni Morrison, and Don DeLillo, makes this case even more explicitly than any other kind of story. Here's why. Our political leaders and our moral arbiters, religious, corporate, and academic, would have us believe that human beings are fundamentally either right or wrong, good or evil, and that our behavior and beliefs need to be prescribed, governed, arbitrated, and punished or rewarded by others, by those who, by virtue of their office, education, class status, race, religion, or birthright, are more qualified to judge our behavior and beliefs than we ourselves are. The novel especially, but all forms of story that are neither meant to be merely entertainment nor intended strictly to produce social or political change, deny this assumption. They reject it outright. Inasmuch as the novelist in the act of writing his or her novels opposes the official view of anything or anyone, he or she is a saboteur of received opinion. The serious novelist, who is often comic, by example and through his or her art, affirms the transcendent value of the individual and that individual's private consciousness of being briefly alive and soon to be permanently dead. At the center of every morally ambitious novel is a vision of the supreme worth of an individual human being's secret private consciousness, which without the novel is barely known even to oneself, much less acknowledged as significant to others. In this sense, and it is a crucially defining sense, today and in the past, and one hopes for as long as human beings tell stories to one another, the novelist is at bottom committed to a life of opposition, a life of speaking truth to power, of challenging and overthrowing received wisdom, and disregarding the official version of everything by means of his or her work. And this is why so many novelists have been censored, imprisoned, exiled, or even killed. For the novelist does not speak in his books for others. The novelist listens to others, especially to those who would otherwise go unheard. The novelist does not step forward in public to be seen by others. He sees himself. He sees others, especially those who otherwise would remain invisible. And by his or her example, as well as by the work itself, he inspires others to listen in the same way and to see. If by means of a novel the individual human being and his or her consciousness of being alive on this planet for a few flickering days or years or decades are signified, are made significant, then those who would deny that significance and all the rights and privileges that go with it must be seen as deaf and blind at best and otherwise as criminals. A proper novel is both a celebration of the single solitary human being and an indictment of those who refuse to join the celebration. And that celebrated individual human being might be anyone, rich or poor, white or black, Christian or Muslim or Jew. He might be an atheist, a madman, a saint or a common criminal. He might be monstrous or merely wicked. He might be a sap or a savant. He or she might be you, or the person sitting next to you. But when we enter the world of the novel in which he or she resides, and live with him there for the duration, we will never see or hear his or her representative on earth again in the same way. We know that things don't really change at the center, they merely get renovated. The bloody century just ended and the new century recently begun have taught us that. It's as much a fact for protest novels like The Jungle and Uncle Tom's Cabin as it is for Joyce's Ulysses and Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury and Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. Change occurs only at the edges, one human being at a time. And it occurs most significantly and in a viral, exponential way by means of words. Words made into sentences, sentences made into stories, stories made into novels. I spoke earlier about the novelist as citizen who is perhaps by nature devoted to justice, human rights, and equality, and along with the rest of the intelligentsia casts that easy vote. And the novelist as activist, as propagandist, if you will, whose writing is bent to a political purpose. And I've contrasted both with the novelist as artist, a person devoted strictly to the art of the novel. But what about the literary artist who is also what we call a public intellectual, the écrivain engagé? Is that a possible role for a writer to play in our world today? Or if a possible role, is it even necessary or useful for the artist, him or herself, and for the larger community itself? It's not at all unusual in Western Europe, South America, and Africa, and many Asian countries as well, for literary artists to find themselves invited to express in the media and to the people in charge of policy their considered opinions on public affairs, on the issues of the day, on candidates running for political office, of foreign and domestic policy, and so forth. Even I, as an American, am often invited by the French press to comment on the issues of the day. Most of the time, however, on American politicians. But in most countries, it's generally thought that literary artists are more likely than members of the governing class to possess the long view, and that the long view is rather helpful in obtaining a more or less coherent short view. It's also generally thought that literary artists are less likely than policymakers to be beholden to what we call special interests. Except, of course, on the rare occasion when they themselves run for political office, like Mario Vargas Llosa, for instance, who ran for president of Peru, or Václav Havel, or the late Aimé Césaire of Martinique, or in the US, the previously mentioned Upton Sinclair, who ran for Congress as a socialist and nearly became governor of California as an independent. Interestingly, however, as soon as these figures ran for office, they lost all credibility as public intellectuals, and not until they were defeated, like Vargas Llosa or Upton Sinclair, or retired, like Havel, or died, like Césaire, did they regain it. And yes, it's true that in a democratic republic like the United States, one can say and publish almost anything one wants to. But it's also true that where the literary artist is regarded as a mere entertainer, as only a little more essential to the common weal than a luxurious diversion, then he or she will end up marginalized, forced to speak solely to the choir. And when it comes to affecting change, affecting public policy, the choir, made up mostly of fellow artists and intellectuals, is essentially powerless. By and large, the people nowadays who pass as public intellectuals in the United States and to a considerable degree in Western Europe operate out of think tanks and universities and hold to ideologically determined agendas financed largely by the military-industrial academic complex of multinational corporations. They are sociologists and historians, scientists and bureaucrats, scholars and out-of-work journalists, pundits, and policy wonks. In the US especially, paid to produce papers, articles, and books that will further the political ambitions of one or the other of our two political parties and the financial interests of corporate America. From time to time, one or another of them is invited to come up to the big house and help run the plantation. For the Bush years, think Paul Wolfowitz, Condoleezza Rice, Elliott Abrams. Obama brought in Lawrence Summers, Timothy Geithner, and the CEO of General Electric. Mostly, they are intelligent, well-educated, worldly people with good intentions. But they are certainly not poets, novelists, playwrights, or artists of any sort. Nor are we likely to find any of them in Congress or the Senate. Our true poets, novelists, and dramatists do not get to help run the plantation. By and large, they are viewed by those in power as merely a bauble that affirms our leaders' good taste and refinement. And for that, the president invites one of us to read a poem at his inauguration ceremony, and now and then hangs a gold medal around a few of our necks at the Kennedy Center and says, "Thanks for amusing us, but now it's time for you to go back to your playthings and let the adults get on with the serious business of running the world." Not that I think our poets, novelists, and dramatists could run the country or the world much better than George W. Bush's gang of miscreants and venal incompetents did for 8 years. Or as well as the new crowd of Ivy-educated technocrats, policy wonks, and ex-university presidents and captains of collapsed financial empires, most of whom are trying to solve the very problems that they and their colleagues created. Although I confess, the idea of a world-class novelist, poet, or dramatist as President of the United States has its attractions. If we had an artist as president, I rather doubt we'd be marred in Afghanistan or still guarding the prisoners at Guantanamo or assassinating suspected terrorists with drones in Yemen and Pakistan and soon, no doubt, in Syria and elsewhere, or creating the most comprehensive surveillance system the world has ever known. And the American and possibly the world's economy might not have imploded in 2009. Still, I wouldn't wish that fate on my fellow novelists, poets, and dramatists. We need the moral and linguistic clarity of their writing. We need the products of their solitude more than we need their human decency in the corridors of political power. And that's the real problem, isn't it? We need human decency in governance and moral and linguistic clarity in literature. But can the twain ever meet? Honestly, I fear they cannot, not anymore. Given the present and future dominance of democratic governments and therefore of all public policy by multinational corporate interests, it seems more than unlikely, it seems impossible for the moral and linguistic clarity of our literary artists to have the slightest influence on the moral and linguistic imaginations and behavior of those who rule us. Even with an American president who certainly is a fine writer and who gives every evidence of possessing an ingrained respect for linguistic clarity, a man who reintroduced the notion of complexity and nuance to governance after its 8-year absence, and who has made intelligence more or less respectable again. Our elected officials and their appointees, and we as a people, both in the United States and here in Western Europe, have essentially ghettoized the literary imagination. The structure of our consumer economy and the corporate means of distribution of story and poem have brought about the permanent niching of the literary mind. The world, at least our literary world, sometimes seems to be breaking up into small colonies of the saved, as if we were entering a new dark age. If so, then perhaps the most important task, perhaps the only task we can set ourselves from here on out, is to sustain, articulate, and preserve through literature for the coming generations, for those who will live in that coming dark age, the essential human values that early in the evolutionary history of our species distinguished us from our higher primate cousins: loving kindness, protection of the young, the weak, and the elderly, and consciousness of mortality. To quote Flannery O'Connor again, in the greatest fiction, the writer's moral sense coincides with his dramatic sense, and I see no way for it to do this unless his moral judgment is part of the very act of seeing, and he is free to use it. This is not something that can be done by us in our capacity as a citizen of one country or another. Nor is it accomplished by the protest novel, books like The Jungle and Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it has never been a particular concern of the writer in his or her role of public intellectual. Simply put, we must not be allowed to forget what it is to be human. The worst of it, what we share with our higher primate cousins, as well as the best of it, what we share with the angels. No other species needs to be constantly reminded and taught with each new generation what it is to be itself. And it is our storytellers, our poets, our novelists and dramatists who have always performed this task. And surely in this moment, in the history of our species, when there is such a danger of forgetting, when there is so much inducement to forget, we must not waste our limited time here doing anything else. Okay.
Alors rassurez-vous, hein, il ne s'agit pas du tout de traduire cette magnifique conférence de Russell Banks, mais peut-être juste de saisir quelques arêtes de sa proposition, de la proposition qu'il vous fait ce soir, hein, c'est un texte qu'il a écrit pour l'occasion. Saisir ce texte pour délimiter, disons, les contours les plus saillants et nourrir la discussion, pour être sûr qu'on est tous d'accord sur ce qu'il a dit et vous inviter à réagir. Donc, on peut dire, si vous voulez, que bon, l'entrée en matière, vous l'avez compris, hein, était l'attitude de linguistique, finalement, de Russell Banks, écrivain, à l'égard du mot indignation. Ce mot sur lequel on lui avait demandé de réfléchir, et qui a été un mot très à la mode, disons, il y a 2 ans, l'année dernière, pour désigner un certain nombre d'attitudes, peut-être plus morales que politiques, mais appelées en tout cas à intervenir sur le champ politique. Et Russell Banks est parti de cette constatation linguistique d'écrivain, que le mot indignation avait une signification et un champ assez distinct en français et en anglais, et qu'on peut résumer de la manière suivante: tandis qu'indignation peut sembler une qualité morale en français, en langue française, en fait ça serait dans les langues latines, hein, parce que c'est la même chose en espagnol ou en italien. Il n'en va pas de même en anglais, où le terme est plutôt un terme connoté de manière péjorative, et l'indignation est plutôt une réaction de classe, disons de supériorité de classe, à l'égard d'un inférieur. Et donc le mot indignation le choquait un peu, hein, d'autant plus que la troisième signification, hein, renvoie à une réaction de rejet, hein, alimentaire, hein, avoir une indignation. Et j'ai pensé en l'écoutant qu'en fait c'était ce qu'on appelait, il y aurait la même ambiguïté en français que le mot intolérance, puisqu'on parle d'intolérance alimentaire. Voilà. Et après cette entrée en matière, si j'ose dire, sur le terme d'indignation, il a pris à bras-le-corps. Si vous avez lu des romans de Russell Banks, hein, vous savez que la moindre des choses qu'on peut dire de lui, c'est que ce n'est pas un écrivain qui a froid aux yeux, hein, et qui prend les choses de front. Et donc il a pris de front la question. Alors, pour aller vite, hein, aussi parce que peut-être tu es un peu fatigué, donc on va pas non plus...
Non, non.
Mais pour aller vite, je dirais la chose suivante, c'est que son exposé, me semble, repose sur 3 systèmes de distinction. Donc je vais dire ça, et puis après on ouvrira le débat, si vous voulez. Bon, le premier système de distinction, et un système de distinction qu'il a voulu opérer d'emblée, qui est, disons, l'engagement de l'homme, du citoyen, de l'individu et de l'écrivain. Une chose est d'être un homme engagé, et Dieu sait que par exemple lui il l'est, dans la vie politique américaine, mais aussi internationale. Il est appelé à commenter l'actualité, à intervenir, etc. Et il ne s'en prive pas. Autre chose, et donc là il exprime, comme il disait, le point de vue du citoyen, le point de vue de l'individu. Et puis autre chose, de parler en tant qu'écrivain. Et pour lui, écrivain, il l'a bien précisé, hein, c'est un terme qui est revenu au moins 2 fois dans sa conférence, hein, ça veut dire romancier, dans son cas, même s'il est aussi poète, mais il ne veut pas qu'on rappelle cet épisode. Il a écrit 2 recueils de poésie. Ça veut dire romancier, et en fait, disons, le mot que tu as rappelé 2 fois, hein, c'est artiste. Artiste de l'écriture. Donc, qu'est-ce que ça veut dire disons, l'indignation, non pas de l'écrivain citoyen pris du côté citoyen, mais de l'écrivain citoyen pris du côté artistique. Et c'est là, me semble-t-il, qu'il a établi la seconde distinction, qui évidemment est une manière de provocation, mais une provocation pour la pensée, pour vous, pour nous, qui est la distinction entre 2 modèles. On peut protester, s'indigner en tant qu'écrivain à la manière dont le firent Upton Sinclair dans La Jungle, ou un roman qui est mieux connu en français, La case de l'oncle Tom, de Harriet Beecher Stowe. Et cette manière, c'est ce qu'il a appelé des protest novels. Il a rappelé l'importance de ces romans, hein, sans aucune ironie, hein, l'importance de ces romans, l'un contribuant à améliorer la condition des travailleurs qui travaillent dans les manufactures de viande, et l'autre, évidemment, qui a contribué à attirer l'attention des Américains sur le sort des esclaves. Comme il le disait, évidemment, ces romans sont des romans importants, lourds, mais qui, pour la plupart, enfin, pour ces 2 cas, disais-tu, n'ont pas été pris comme des romans d'artistes. Et pourquoi disais-tu cela? Parce que, en réalité, ces protest novels, alors là, je traduis dans un lexique plus pédagogique pour la discussion, hein. En réalité, c'est des romans prescriptifs. C'est-à-dire, ils prescrivent des conduites. Ils prescrivent des conduites. Et par rapport à ces romans prescriptifs, tu as opposé une autre manière de faire des romans d'indignation, ou si indignation n'est pas le mot, d'autres types de romans artistiques, qui sont des romans descriptifs. Donc je crois que vraiment cette seconde distinction, elle est très importante, et si on connaît ton œuvre, ou si on l'approche même pour la première fois ce soir, on est très frappé. Hein. Si tes romans sont des romans politiquement très engagés, hein, on n'y trouvera aucune prescription, aucune invitation à voter pour tel ou tel côté de l'échiquier politique, ce qui relève du citoyen, et tu le fais. Mais l'écrivain, lui, c'est quelqu'un qui donne des descriptions. Des descriptions d'existence, de leur complexité. Et tu disais, it's a different job. Hein, c'est une autre histoire, c'est une autre affaire, c'est une autre manière de faire de la littérature engagée. Et disais-tu, hein, moi ce que je fais, hein, c'est essentiellement de proposer des histoires de figures, de personnages, de caractères, hein, dont la version doit être entendue, dont la version des grands processus historiques qui sont les processus qui gouvernent l'histoire contemporaine, hein, doit être entendue. Ça rappelle beaucoup, hein, vous connaissez sans doute ce texte de Brecht, hein, qui a tellement impressionné Benjamin, qui lui a consacré plusieurs pages, hein, faire l'histoire des vaincus. L'histoire, la politique de Russell Banks, elle n'est pas dans la prescription politique ou un engagement, disons à l'ancienne, qui consisterait à dire, ben voilà, regardez ces gens, ça consiste à dire, regardez comment vivent ces gens. Et regardez la manière dont ils contribuent à l'histoire contemporaine. Et d'ailleurs, dans le texte que tu avais choisi, sur Continental Drift, il y avait cette idée justement d'être attentif à des processus historiques, sociologiques, politiques, qui ne sont pas les processus les plus visibles,
géologiques,
mais les processus géologiques qui font l'histoire sociale et politique des gens. Et là, de cette deuxième distinction, découlait une troisième qui me paraît tout à fait importante et je crois qui est vraiment une contribution importante à ce que la MRL ici a essayé de faire avec ce problème, écrire pour, avec, contre. Cette troisième distinction, c'est quand tu as dit, et tu as bien insisté là-dessus, qu'en fait, un écrivain comme toi, il n'essaie pas d'écrire pour les autres. C'est-à-dire, en fait, un écrivain, c'est paradoxal, parce qu'on pourrait dire que l'écrivain engagé, c'est typiquement, selon un schéma, excusez-moi de dire ça, mais c'est bien comme ça, qui est à la fois messianique et léniniste, de la fine pointe de l'intelligentsia, qui parle pour les autres. Et toi, tu te dis, c'est pas ça, en fait. Moi, j'essaie pas de parler pour les autres. J'essaie d'écouter les autres. Et ça, je crois que c'est un point très important, parce que c'est ça, finalement, l'échec de l'engagement à l'ancienne. L'engagement à l'ancienne, c'est quoi? C'est l'écrivain, l'intellectuel illuminé, qui descend dans la caverne, et qui est capable, avec les lumières de son intelligence et de sa sensibilité, d'éclairer les conduites opaques de ceux qui en sont les acteurs passifs plutôt que les acteurs actifs. Et Russell Banks dit non, non, moi c'est pas ça qui m'intéresse, j'ai pas un point de vue surplombant, transcendant par rapport à l'aliénation, j'écoute les autres et je leur donne la parole. Donc ça veut dire que l'ancien schéma de l'engagement, pour reprendre une figure rhétorique, c'était celui, vous connaissez cette figure, vous l'avez étudiée au collège, de la prosopopée. Faire parler les morts, faire parler les dieux, faire parler les opprimés. La prosopopée de Russell Banks, c'est très particulière. Elle est très particulière. Alors, je le redis, il ne s'agit pas donc d'écrire des romans engagés au sens où ce serait un citoyen qui parle, c'est un artiste qui s'exprime. Il ne s'agit pas de faire des romans prescriptifs qui engageraient à voter, mais des romans descriptifs. Et puis, il ne s'agit pas de parler pour les autres, mais d'écouter les autres. Alors, disait-il, il en découle de cette triple distinction une nouvelle, en réalité, nouvelle position de l'écrivain aux États-Unis aujourd'hui. Qu'en est-il? Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire être un écrivain with commitment in America today? Et tu disais, ben voilà, en fait, dans la situation américaine contemporaine, on peut constater quelque chose, c'est que évidemment les écrivains ne font pas partie, on va dire, du personnel socio-professionnel le plus appelé par les administrations à exprimer ou à participer aux décisions collectives. Et en un certain sens, tu disais, c'est peut-être tant mieux, parce que ceux qui l'ont fait dans d'autres pays, quand ils l'ont fait, se sont un peu disqualifiés comme écrivains et en tout cas n'apparaissaient plus comme des écrivains capables de verser, justement, d'offrir aux lecteurs des versions où on entendait justement la parole des autres. Alors tu faisais bien, et on connaît tes positions sur la question, une distinction très claire entre ce qu'on appelle ici l'administration Bush et l'administration Obama, mais tu disais que même si l'administration Obama, qui a plutôt fait appel à des universitaires, d'anciens directeurs de cabinets d'audit, etc., plutôt qu'à des hommes d'affaires comme la précédente, eh bien, même dans le gouvernement Obama, on ne va pas trouver beaucoup d'écrivains. Même si Obama est quelqu'un qui, comme tu disais, a redonné une certaine clarté à la langue. Alors, disais-tu, finalement, c'est quoi aujourd'hui un écrivain qui est engagé, dans la mesure précisément où cet engagement est nouvellement redéfini, comme tu l'as fait toi, c'est quelqu'un qui, comme tu disais, finalement, est amené à rappeler par ses descriptions aux humains, hein, et j'ai envie de dire, de rappeler ce que tu as dit aux lycéens cet après-midi, aux collégiens cet après-midi. Parce qu'on était cet après-midi, quelques-uns d'entre nous, à entendre le débat entre Russell Banks et 200 collégiens. Et Russell Banks a dit, voilà, moi quand je regarde ce que j'ai fait et ce que je fais, je m'aperçois que j'ai toujours voulu répondre à 4 questions. La première question, c'est de quoi et de qui devons-nous avoir peur? La deuxième question, c'est de qui ou quoi voulons-nous protéger? La troisième question, c'est d'où venons-nous? Et la quatrième question, c'est où allons-nous? Et tu disais, pour conclure ton intervention de ce soir, que finalement, ce que doit faire un écrivain dans sa version nouvelle de l'engagement, hein, c'est de ne pas oublier que nous ne sommes personne, nous ne sommes pas des animaux humains, si nous ne sommes pas capables de tenir ensemble ces 4 questions. Merci.
Merci à vous.
Alors on peut dire que la discussion est ouverte. Bon, c'est pas facile de poser des questions à Russell Banks, bien sûr, mais bon. Monsieur ?
Oui, c'est une question aux citoyens, mais aussi à vous en tant qu'écrivain. Vous avez voté 2 fois pour Barack Obama. Pour vous, vous l'avez déclaré, Edward Snowden est un héros, donc c'est la bête noire de l'administration Obama actuelle. Vous avez également parlé des crimes de guerre qu'il y avait eu en Afghanistan et en Irak. J'aimerais savoir quelle est votre vision actuelle du prix Nobel de la paix, Barack Obama.
So you did your votation for Obama 2 times. You defend Snowden. You attack the administration about Afghanistan. So what is your vision of Obama today?
It sounds like a contradiction, doesn't it? Vote for Obama twice, and yet I support people and take positions which are contrary to Obama. But I've tried in thinking about Obama and my views of him to keep 2 things apart. One is the symbolic value of having a president who is a black man. It's as simple as that. It's an enormous symbolic value. It normalizes a black man in the most powerful position in the United States and perhaps in the world, but in the United States particularly, given our history of race, this is extraordinary. And in these 8 years, it has become normal. Nobody really makes a big deal out of it. There's still a huge segment of the American white, I would say mostly male, over 50 population that find it disgraceful that we have a black president, but we don't worry too much about them. The rest of us are comfortable and happy that that has happened, and now we need to get a woman president and normalize that, and then we can probably move on into the future without worrying about these things so much. But on the other hand, politically, I viewed him from the very beginning as somewhat to the right of Bill Clinton. And he has only borne that out over the years. And so I've criticized his politics as aggressively as I would have criticized any president whose policies I disagreed with. I could not in any way vote against him because he is to the left of the Bush and to the left of Romney, even though it still puts him somewhat to the right of center. The American political spectrum has, over the last 25 years, moved so far to the right that the center now, which is where Obama stands, is somewhat to the right of where Richard Nixon stood. I'm quite serious. If you look at Richard Nixon's policies, Richard Nixon was pushing for health care, national health care, back in the 70s. So that's what's happened in the American political spectrum, so you have to look at him in that context, and it's from that I've approached him politically and why I oppose him so much. The whole question of Snowden and the surveillance, the NSA surveillance, is a whole other thing And that's institutional and structural and has to do with a certain kind of madness that began in September 11th in 2001 and continues unabated. Even in such small ways, if you don't mind my continuing just a second on the subject. The news of the last 24 hours in Washington is that basically what happened was a woman had a nervous breakdown just outside the Capitol and got shot for it. And then we were quickly reassured that it was not associated with terrorism. But the combination of the two, the killing of this woman, and then the assurance that it's not terrorism, makes it terrorism.
Mm-hmm. The listener there asked, what do you think about Obama's Nobel Prize for Peace?
Oh, it was an embarrassment for me, frankly. And I just thought, what it did basically was diminish the Nobel Peace Prize. It didn't hurt Obama, it didn't help Obama. It actually probably hurt him in the United States, maybe internationally too. But it really diminished the Nobel Peace Prize. I remember when Kissinger was up for it. I mean, you know, it's been distributed rather loosely.
Dominique?
Comme Martin l'a tout à fait brillamment résumé, il y a l'aspect descriptif plutôt que prescriptif dans vos romans. Dans le dernier traduit, La mémoire perdue de la peau, vous suivez deux personnages en décrivant une réalité extrêmement dure mais contemporaine, actuelle, et qui paraît presque de la science-fiction tellement c'est cru comme description. Dans d'autres romans comme Trailer Park ou dans American Darling, vous décrivez aussi des situations tout en décrivant des personnages, la vie de personnages. On vous sent à la fois profondément attaché à ces personnages, à décrire leur vie, et en même temps, vous les faites évoluer dans un univers tellement noir ou pessimiste, et là ça rejoint votre conférence de tout à l'heure avec ce mouvement inéluctable des gens qui signifient une réalité géopolitique par exemple, qu'on vous sent parfois, en tout cas c'est ma perception, déchiré entre la compassion et l'amour que vous avez pour ces personnages et leur sort. Est-ce que je me trompe?
Well, he stresses something like a contradiction between your attachment to your love for your character and the hardness of the world they get into it.
Well, I think I understand your question, because it does perhaps seem to be a contradiction between my rather bleak view of the universe and the possibilities for human ability and to be, you know, matched up with their achievements and so forth. On the one hand, and then what you see as an affection and compassion for my characters and for the people who are suffering for that. I don't see any contradiction. In fact, I think that that's simply at the heart of all literature that matters and story that matters. That in the darkness of the universe, how can you not have affection and compassion for people who struggle in it, through the night of it, you know. Even the mad. This is ancient. This is not just something that's true of modern literature. I mean, look at Lear standing on the heath, you know, naked, in the rain pouring down. I mean, we have enormous compassion for him. And the universe could not be darker than it is in that play at that moment. And you can do this all the way through history of story and see that contradiction not resolved so much as just simply ignored. If anything, I would say they feed each other. You know, if the world were not dark, how could I have such affection for these people? You know, I'd have a slight disdain. Don't you see the sun is shining? For heaven's sakes, get up and walk. But in fact, the sun isn't shining. I don't know if that answers the question. But
You did. Monsieur?
It's of course fascinating listening to you, Mr. Banks, and it's a great moment to have you here. I hope your conference will be published somehow or be made available in one way or the other. I think I'm 98% convinced about the role of the artist and of the novelist and with the issues, his role. However, there remains a last little piece of way to go. Some people are attracted by that kind of problems, and some others, the choice of issues where an artist engages himself is, of course, it's a personal choice, of course, but that remains a message in itself. Some novelists would confine their thinking and their message to much more intimate or personal or small town issues, but you're looking for well, political issues of a worldwide dimension, or other political things. So there is a way of teaching and of not prescribing, but still of guiding the reader in one direction or the other by those choices, which may not be conscious ones, just instinctive. But perhaps you can comment on that.
I think I was trying to point to that in the passage in the text where I began to speak about what the novel does in terms of giving significance to the subjective experience of an individual, and that by attending to that, the novel does, as the novelist must, by attending to that subjective experience and giving significance to it in the story, the novelist is running against received opinion in doing so, and in setting an example too, paying attention. When I read novels as a young man, very young man, first as a white man coming out of New England who had not ever met a black person, I was surrounded by the racial attitudes of my family and of my community. But when I read Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, when I read James Baldwin's essays in the late 1950s, and I was just 18 and 19 years old, I never saw a black person again the same way. It changed how I saw other human beings forever, for the rest of my life. My imagination was enlarged by the fact that I read those books. And I think that I was trying to point to that and say that that is a political act. You know, the imaginative embrace of another human being is a political act. And it alters us politically as a result. And that's what I was trying to do. But it happens only one at a time, one reader at a time. What occurs when you pick up a novel that I have written or anyone has written, in your mind, your imagination, is that you create half the story. You bring to it your dreams, your memories, your reflections, your experiences, your body, really, to that story. And you fill out the blanks. Just as I, when I wrote it, was filling out the blanks on my side with my dreams and memories, reflections, my body. The reading experience is a kind of commune between the two of us, where you're creating that text just as much as I am in the act of reading. Your imagination is being engaged and enlarged just as much as mine was in the act of writing it. So to me, that's a political act. That's a kind of solidarity to me. Does that make sense? I'm worried about that 2% you have.
It's just the choice you make, but they may not be conscious, and it's part of the personality that you're interested in Somalis, Afghans, Khmer. You could be interested in other subjects. But, I guess
it's true, of course.
We have to take this with the artist. I mean, his choices of subjects, of situations, and
this is true. And where am I led? You know, I'm led, as you say, by my intuitions, by my unconscious. I have to trust that what attracts me will have significance for me and ultimately for someone else as well. There is no way around that. So this is of course true.
Monsieur?
Nancy? One thing that always struck me when reading your novels was that I find them to be extremely different from one another. Well, I'd be tempted to sort of assign them to 2 or 3 different groups, but then of course, that's my own perception, as you were just saying. You know, the reader puts a lot into the story himself. Right. And now it's a question which, well, you may prefer not to answer, that's okay. But among these various groups or strands of novel writing that you have produced, would you consider some to be, in a sense, more intimately connected to your own personal story?
Yes, I suppose I would, but they might not be the ones you would think were connected to my own personal story.
You know, for example,
yes.
The one that struck me, you know, that hit me possibly hardest, I don't know if it's Rule of Bone or Affliction, probably, or Sweet Hereafter, one of the 3. My fave remains American Darling, for other reasons. Now, the first 3, to me, seem to resonate, I suspected, but then I may be completely off base, resonated in a way such that I imagine that they were also closest to you.
No, Rule of the Bone was not at all based on my own life, with a small proviso. I did, when I was 16 years old, become homeless briefly. I stole a car and dropped away from school and family, and it took months before the police caught me. And so that mentality helped me understand the character of Bone in that novel. But other than that, none of that is autobiographical. I did live in Jamaica in the middle 70s, and so I borrowed heavily from my experiences in Jamaica I could have put him in Trinidad, I could have put him any number of places. I wanted him out of the country, in a black country. And that happened to be one that I knew well, so I was just simply avoiding doing a lot of research that I didn't have to do. But American Darling actually is based in many ways very closely on my own experience in the 1960s and 70s. I was very active politically, and one of the founders of the SDS chapter at my university, and I was very close to a lot of people who went on into the Weather Underground, just as Hannah Musgrave does in that. Even though it's a novel narrated by a woman, looking back from her 60s to her youth in the 1960s and 70s and coming forward, I knew women like her. I always wondered what it was like to be them. And I experienced a great deal that she had experienced. And drew very heavily on my own memories of that era in writing that. But you see, it's very difficult to nail a novel or a story or the elements and images of a story to the author because they get reconfigured in the process of writing the same way they get reconfigured in your dreams. You know, a dream is not a record of your day. You know, it's a reconfiguration of everything, of memory, of what passed before you. You weren't even conscious of it at the time, of a conversation overheard in a subway car. Who knows? And so the same way with fiction. And so it's very difficult to read a novel backwards to the author's life. For years, Affliction was thought to be my story. In fact, it's not anyone's story in my immediate family. It's close in some ways to my father's story because he was alcoholic and he was violent and he tried not to be either. But that's true for thousands of men that I've known, and not just my father. But most people who read the book think that it was about my father. A novel that you were mentioning earlier, Hamilton Stark. My aunt once came up to me. She said, "I read your novel, and I hate what you did with your grandmother," which was her mother. And I said, "There's no grandmother in that novel." She was thinking that the mother was her mother, therefore it had to be my grandmother. She was reading as portraiture, which was not a good way to read a novel.
Madame?
Yes, well, I agree with the difference you made between two kinds of novels, and with the fact that maybe the Uncle Tom's Cabin is not literature. But now I have a difficult question related to French literature. Mm-hmm. How would you judge, for instance, the work of Rousseau?
It's
it
a
has
good-
some impact on politics
It's a
and
good
it's
place.
literature.
It's a good place to ask this question.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I first read Rousseau as a novelist, and when I was maybe 19, 20 years old, 19 or 20 years old or so, and as a romantic novelist, and I thought as a sentimentalist too. I didn't give him, as I wasn't sufficiently educated perhaps, a historical and social and political context. It was later when I began to read his essays and philosophical writings and political writings that I began to see the context for the novels. It's difficult for me to say yes, no, or maybe about the books. I haven't read them since I was 18, the novels themselves, and I can't remember very clearly how effective they were in the terms that you're suggesting. What would you say about this?
Well, actually, I'm paid for that. Non, je ne veux pas répondre à cette question.
No, it's really interesting.
Non, mais si la question est de savoir si Rousseau c'est descriptif ou prescriptif.
Oui, enfin, les romans sont de la littérature, mais en même temps ont eu une influence sur la vision des choses, notamment au XVIIIe et XIXe siècle.
Alors, bon, je dirais deux choses, si vous voulez. La première, c'est que il ne me semble pas que l'intention de Russell Banks ait été de dire qu'un roman descriptif a moins d'effet qu'un roman prescriptif. Je dirais au contraire que pour lui, aujourd'hui, la seule manière d'avoir des effets politiques réels est d'agir sur les sensibilités par des romans descriptifs, parce que les romans prescriptifs apparaissent comme moins efficaces. Alors, à ce titre, La Nouvelle Héloïse, puisque c'est de cela qu'on parle, est un roman vraiment descriptif, hein, puisqu'il décrit l'itinéraire de deux amants qui ne peuvent pas s'aimer pour des raisons sociales, il faut toujours le rappeler, qui a eu, comme vous le rappelez, des effets, alors politiques, je ne sais pas, mais disons sociologiques, et en tout cas qui ont influencé l'imaginaire social de ce que pouvait être l'amour à partir des années 1760 de manière tout à fait considérable. Au point même, je vous le rappelle, et c'est pour aller dans votre sens, que les passages plus strictement prescriptifs du roman, c'est-à-dire 4e et 5e partie, sur l'économie de Clarence, sont apparus comme des fautes de goût qui contredisaient, ce qui n'était pas du tout l'intention, l'avis de Rousseau, qui avait une vision très claire de ce qu'il faisait, mais pour Diderot, par exemple, ces parties, elles vont contre le sens politique du livre. Hein. Donc, mais je crois que le point important, vous avez raison, c'est de dire que le descriptif, ce que fait un écrivain quand il décrit une société, les personnages dont Russell parlait tout à l'heure, hein, les personnages de Dérive des continents, les personnages dont Dominique parlait, la manière de rentrer dans ces destins privés, comme fait Rousseau pour l'Héloïse, hein, c'est une manière de contribuer à une réorganisation de l'imaginaire social qui est politique. Voilà. Et ça, c'est indépendant de savoir si on condamne la politique d'Obama ou pas. D'ailleurs, il y a quelqu'un qui a dit ça de manière très, très précise, c'est Marx. Quand Marx parle de Balzac, je vous rappelle qu'il dit Balzac, c'est l'écrivain le plus réactionnaire qu'ait connu la France des années 30, et c'est celui qui a donné les descriptions les plus en avance pour contribuer au changement de l'imaginaire social de la société, disons, des années 1830-1840. Et ça, je crois que il y a peut-être un aspect palinodique aussi dans ce que dit Russell Banks. La palinodie, c'est-à-dire que je crois que pour des écrivains qui se sont formés comme lui à la fin des années 60, le commitment, l'engagement, avait pour unique modèle un commitment prescriptif. C'est même le cas de Baldwin, par exemple.
Yeah, well, Zola. Hein? Or John Dos Passos.
Ou Dos Passos.
Yeah.
Et le retour ou l'invention d'une nouvelle forme descriptive de ce que Russell Banks n'arrête pas d'appeler les marginalisés, les laissés pour compte, etc., de réintroduire ce point de vue dans une Amérique qui a tendance à imposer un seul imaginaire social. Parce que c'est ça surtout, disons, le côté un peu apocalyptique de ta vision de l'Amérique aujourd'hui, c'est ce que tu rappelais dans l'interview que tu as donnée dans un journal important ce matin, c'est justement, disons, le lissage de l'imaginaire. Et on peut dire, je crois, en pratiquant l'art de la litote, que les romans de Russell Banks sont tous sauf lisses. Peut-être une dernière question? Ouais.
Oui, c'était justement par rapport à l'entretien que vous avez donné au Temps, pour le citer. Vous citez Nelson Aldren, qui est un écrivain qui a parlé justement des laissés pour compte, des marginaux, et qui a été la principale influence d'un historien américain que vous connaissez sans doute, qui est marxiste, qui s'appelle Howard Zinn, qui a beaucoup écrit sur les couches populaires. Alors j'aimerais savoir si vous pouvez nous dire quelques mots de Nelson Aldren, de la manière dont vous avez.
Yes, what did you say that was the main influence?
The main influence on me from Nelson Aldrin you're speaking of, it was twofold. I was very fortunate to know him personally when I was very young, in my early 20s, and he took me under his wing and was a mentor for me. First as a writer, I mean, his work was I thought, and I still believe, very important chapter in the history of American literature in the 1940s and 50s when he was doing his best work. But also, he was a figure I could identify with and learn how to invent myself as a writer, and which was a difficult thing for me, and it is, I think, for most anyone to do. And where a mentor can play that role, both by his work and by his stance toward the process of writing and his stance toward the larger world, the community that surrounds us. So he was very important to me. Anecdotally, I met him when I was 22 years old at a writers' conference. He read my terrible novel manuscript, and he raced through it, and he said, "That's a good sentence." Then he went 40 pages more, and he said, "That's a good paragraph." And then another 50 pages, and he said, "There's a nice little piece of dialogue here, kid." And then he said, now write a whole novel that's as good as those places, and you've got a really good book. He said, "But the important thing, kid, is that you've got it. You're going to be able to do it." And it was like the laying on of hands. It was a blessing, and saying that was all I needed to hear. I didn't need him to go through it line by line to improve my novel. I needed him to tell me that whatever it was necessary for me to become a novelist, I had it. And it was evident in that paragraph, that sentence, that little bit of dialogue. And then he started telling me stories about Simone de Beauvoir, which you can imagine how that made me feel. The inside dope, you know, about Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, because it had just become, she had just published her account of her long love affair with Albert, and he was mortified by it.
Une dernière question? Oui? Oui?
Yes, dernière question.
Thank you very much. Reading your books has been a revelation for me, and I'm not European, I'm not American, but I wanted to bring up very shortly three things. First of all, this word indignation, whether in French or in English, I believe it doesn't really translate what's happening, what the young people today in certain countries which are led by dictators, where there's no justice, there's no human rights, and there's a lot of repression. They want their rights, they want their ideals of being like, you know, Europe, human rights, and you know, where law dominates, and indignation. They're using the word indignation because they're scared. They're absolutely very much scared of their leaders. That if they used, or if they took larger steps, they'd be all dead. And I mean, they are heroes, great, but you know, heroes they can also be massacred very quickly these days. You didn't mention what was happening in Syria, but never mind. I'm not going to. But the other thing also about your writing, what to me was a big revelation, that European literature mostly, especially after the Second World War, was very guttural, you know, personal imagination and inner feelings and psychology and stuff. And you brought in this huge, big world, political and otherwise dimension to literature. And coming from the United Nations, for me, it was the trend to follow, you know, when you're describing the world, and yet you're a writer, you're shaping, reformulating, or upholding values, and that humanity that you're talking about. So, these are the two comments I would make. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you all, too. I'm very grateful for your attention tonight.